because of the pandemic. I guess people are just like, I don't know, I just find I have more conversations with people all over the place.
Yeah, it's true. I'm constantly calculating time differences these days in ways that I don't think I was doing before.
We'll get it wrong 60% of the time, even when I use the what time is it in, and then I send the meeting invite and then I still get it wrong.
Yeah, and then the clocks change and
yeah. You're 6 hours ahead of. No, wait.
It's 8 p.m. here. Okay, so we're live now. So hello everyone, this is Roshni from Systems Change Alliance, and joining me today, or tonight in some places, is Sarah Lazarovic, who's speaking from Toronto. And let me just give a little introduction to Sarah. Sarah is Vice President of Marketing at Clean Prosperity, a climate policy organization that works on solutions to the climate crisis. She's a veteran climate communicator who writes the undepressing climate newsletter, Minimum Viable Planet. She also draws a quarterly comics column on sustainability for Yes magazine. She worked as a journalist and creative director for 15 years before moving to full-time climate work. She's the author of A Bunch of Pretty Things I Did Not Buy, which came out in 2014, a visual manifesto about living with less. But you probably know her best for her Hierarchy of Needs. It's a viral chart about how to buy less stuff. So, hey, Sarah, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I hope the sun is shining in Toronto.
Never. Yesterday, had some sun.
Okay. So just to start off, I'd love to know how you began your career as an illustrator and visual journalist.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I did journalism in university thinking, oh, it seems so antiquated now, but my dream was to work for an alt weekly, like, you know, the Village Voice, those kinds of publications. And I did that for a bit after I graduated in Toronto. I got an internship at our, you know, alternative weekly newspaper and wrote and did comics, but I could never sort of figure out if I was a serious journalist or wanted to do this hybrid model of just a weird sort of journalism that allowed me to do visual reportage, which is a real thing now, but at the time it wasn't really a thing. So I was always just sort of pitching illustrated reporting things and slowly getting traction, but it took me lots of time. And eventually I did, and I worked in that for a number of years. I sort of did an illustrated weekly column for the Ottawa Citizen and the Vancouver Sun, two of our papers, and did weird little comics for a bunch of different publications. Yeah, and like carved a career in as much as one can as journalism is on the wane, but was lucky enough to work for some fun publications who really let me get creative with the format. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, great. So yeah, you mentioned that journalism is changing a lot these days. What are those changes that are taking place?
I mean, I think, you know, the term is solutions journalism, which just means journalism that actively talks about, you know, real meaningful things that we need to do to affect change in the world. And I think I was just sort of on the cusp of that transition. And, you know, had that happened a few years earlier, I might still be a journalist, but I think I was just chafing in the same way that a lot of other people were with journalism, because it felt like, well, especially if you're a person who cares about climate, for so long we had to toe this both sides line. Well, get someone to say this, get someone to say that. And, you know, it just did not mirror what was happening in the world when you were reading the climate science. And I'm like, I can't write these measured articles or do these objective, whatever that means, things when, you know, actually the story needs to be this, and there's no need to entertain any sense of doubt or, you know, nuance about that perspective, because that's been decided. But, you know, I think journalists who cared about climate knew about that about 15 years. And I'd say there's still lots of room for the media to improve, but it's much better now in acknowledging it. But I think, you know, so I left journalism just feeling like I couldn't do that anymore. And I had to work in a capacity where I could just talk about climate all the time in a true way. But publications sort of have developed that due to my mind, great journalism that is totally sound and totally ethical and wonderful, like the publication I work for, Yes magazine. And it just appreciates that the lens of truth is a little bit, needs to be defined a little differently than, not the lens of truth, but just the way we articulate things in the media does not have to be so both sides. And yeah, so they let me, I mean, I'm still interviewing people and I'm still doing research and reportage, but it's just from the context of this is a real thing, this is an emergency, and why can't I talk about it as if that were true without going through the preamble of, you know, a conversation that should have already happened. It's a long-winded way of saying. Yeah, there's more room now, but I think that I sort of made that transition before I found all those outlets, which is fine.
Yeah, I mean, Yes is a great publication, and it's a totally different experience, isn't it? Reading a publication focused, like you say, on solutions, and the kind of feeling you come away with as an individual from those articles and columns and so on. It's just like, wow, okay, I can do something in the world, rather than kind of this crushing feeling of like, yeah, life is depressing.
Yeah, and I'm by no means advocate, you know, only reading like positive news. It's just you want to read news that, you know, accurately represents what's going on and presents viable ways of dealing with the crisis, and not just the climate crisis, but a myriad other social problems that are, you know, increasingly untenable because of climate.
Yeah, and tell me more about how you combine images and words. Like, what's special about that medium? Why do you enjoy working with it?
I just think it's so much easier to get people to pay attention with like a simple chart or a little graphic. And I mean, now there's so many people doing it, but for the longest time, it just felt like there was a void in climate comms when it came to just, you know, people just like, just tell me what to do. But, you know, I don't want to read a 10,000 word article. I just want a chart that says do X, Y, Z. And, you know, the clinical term, or the term is heuristics, like little shorthand ways of translating information for people so that they immediately see, oh, I just need to prioritize, you know, using what I have before I go buy something. Much easier to see that in a bright visual than to have to read, you know, 10,000 words about it, although sometimes that's warranted as well. Yeah, and just for me, I think I've just always been a person who has like both those skills, and my Venn diagram is I like to write and I like to draw. So for me, it was a natural affinity to convey information in that way. I think that the sum, I think my talent is in the blending of those two, as opposed to being a great illustrator or a great writer. So for me, that's my skill set. I think translating things into digestible, fun little nuggets.
Yeah, and how do you take a kind of a seed of an idea and then transform it into a finished piece, be it an image or words, or a combination of both?
Interesting. I mean, it depends. Sometimes it's right away and kind of organic. Sometimes I'm like, I think there's a clear way to say this, and I have to just, you know, play around for a long time. I mean, for a recent chart that I'm thinking of, it's just, you know, I'd interviewed a bunch of academics who work in climate literacy and are talking about and, you know, publishing really interesting, thoughtful research on climate literacy and how bad individuals are through no fault of their own, just when it comes to guesstimating, you know, the carbon intensity of various products or experiences. So, you know, the point is not to, you know, make a hierarchy that's like, this is the best thing to do and this is the worst thing to do. But I was like, surely there's a way we can distill this into a little shorthand that says, you know, work on this first, like transit, heat, meet, repeat. And so like that just popped into my brain, because I think people get really bogged down and they look, you know, the academic journals are the pieces are, you know, thousands and thousands of words long, and they'll have these amazing charts that go through, you know, 100 different things and compare their intensity. But it's like, what's a quick shorthand that I can think about? Well, you know, the biggest bang for your buck is doing X, and then the next thing is this, and the next thing is doing that. So, you know, boom, that's kind of all you need to know. Like if you address things, and obviously, you know, with the caveat that there are nuances, some people don't have any transit issues and, you know, eat a lot more meat, vice versa. But, you know, if the aggregated literature tells us that those are the biggest buckets. And so just to address them in that order. So it sort of comes naturally. Sometimes it's like banging your head against the wall and you're just like, I want to convey this in a simple way, but I don't know how.
I was wondering actually, because you were saying you had kids, whether you sometimes get their input or help on your ideas. Do they
sometimes
give you feedback?
Funny little things. I always try to write down their like climate musings, just because they're so amazing. I mean, that's not so much helping me with ideas. It's more just to realize, to get a perspective outside yourself. My son is like, you know, it's like, it breaks your heart because it's so disarmingly adorable. And he'll just be like, I have an idea. we're just gonna call all the judges. Do you say judges? I forget why he was learning about judges because there's something on the news. And he's like, we're just gonna call the judges and say, stop climate change. So like I write down these things and and sometimes they figure into my cartoons, but I try to respect their privacy. So I don't put too much stuff, but just I like to share what they're saying because I think kids have a very, very new, especially young kids, the way they perceive what's happening is kind of disarming.
Yeah, and I think the pandemic has probably produced a whole load of cute sayings from kids, right? About like, you know, they just understand, yeah, because COVID, or, you know, this kind of, yeah, reading of this really bizarre social situation that has evolved. And were you always interested in these social and environmental topics, or is that something that came at a certain point in your career and changed your course? Or
yeah, I definitely wasn't always interested in climate. I think I pretty much ignored anything anything that had to do with reality. Until I was like my mid to late 20s, I was just sort of like, I just want to make art and I don't care about these, you know, I had very naive ideas about politics and just always said, I'm not political, I'm not interested, which we now know is, you know, a very elitist and privileged thing to say, but just didn't know any better. And, you know, my reckoning was very slow. Like, I think I just kind of started reading more and more. I read Naomi Klein, I think in my early 20s, and then just started down a path towards realizing things were so much different than I thought they were. But even then, I'd say it took me such a long time because the journalistic training is so baked into me that I didn't feel comfortable expressing my opinion about anything on social media or anywhere for so long. I was just always like, I'm a recorder, I'm an observer of what is happening, and far be it from me to advocate on anything. And then I finally hit a wall and was like, no, I care about climate. I just want to talk about climate and work for climate all the time. But I'd say it was like an unlearning process because after studying journalism and working in it, I really had to shift gears and realize that I could have opinions about things and become an activist, if that's the term.
Yeah, it can be sometimes hard to claim that term because I think we can associate it with very specific forms of activism, you know, tying yourself to trees or, you know, lying down in a road or something. But yeah, all these different forms that it takes. And it's great to see, you know, that you're using those skills that you've honed over the years for that specific cause. And you, so you write a regular column or newsletter. I mean, it appears in Yes, doesn't it? But also as a newsletter to subscribers called Minimum Viable Planet. I'm curious about that name. What was the, you know, what does that mean to you? And yeah, how are you developing the ideas with it?
I think it's a little bit tongue in cheek in so much as, you know, I know so many people who feel this way. There's this like desire to do everything you can for climate, and then, you know, not enough time to make a sandwich for your children. And, you know, it can drive you a bit insane because you're like, I want to do this. I want to do that. I want to go to this event. I want to help with that thing. And, you know, we are the privileged billions who are lucky enough to be alive right now where there's an opportunity to change things and, you know, stave off the worst effects of the climate crisis. And yet, you know, we all still have our day-to-day struggles to deal with, and all the more so now with COVID. And it's not a get out of jail card to say that, you know, if you want to make time for something you can, but at the end of the day, there's only so much time when you've got kids and bills and so many things to do. You sort of need a way to just carve out some time. So to me, Minimal Viable Planet is like, how much can I need to carve out a small bit of time so I can work on this thing that is really the most important thing, counterintuitively. So I called it Minimum Viable Planet just to speak to that like, you know, even if someone reads it and only touches in once a week and gets 5 minutes of climate information and like a tiny petition to sign, it's still something, which is part of my theory of change, just that, you know, every little bit matters. And so many people do not have, it's a luxury to have so much time that you can work on all these things at the level that you desire. So I think just wanted to provide an entry point, and yeah, it ends up consuming more than a minimum of my time because it just takes a long time to put it together, but I really enjoy it.
Yeah, I'm sure it takes a lot of work. And yeah, I think what I'm hearing from you is that you know, recognizing this kind of busy lifestyle that we've got into in, you know, the current era. It's this almost this like catch-22 situation of wanting to do something meaningful and then being so kind of caught in the system that we don't have the time to do the meaningful things. So like it sounds like you're trying to speak to people where they're at and just helping make those small steps towards change in their personal lives. And
and I'm definitely, you know, I don't mean to preach incrementalism above all other things. Like, I think the time is gone, the time has passed for incrementalism, but I also just think that people need to be able to just do a little bit of something, and it's so empowering. And if you can do a little something or read something interesting, it gets you going, and it has these positive reinforcement feedback loops that, you know, then sometimes enable you to find time to do other things. You're like, oh, I thought I only had a moment, but I got so inspired by this thing and I realized my priority is actually X. And if I find a way to do a little bit less of this, I can do more of this and join this organization or what have you. And you'd be surprised at like how catalytic it can be. So that's the gist of it.
Yeah, great. And you've written and you've also drawn some images I've seen about the connection between this kind of personal level change and then bigger level systems change, which is obviously what we're kind of talking about. Yeah. How do you see those two levels connecting? Because obviously, you know, we can make changes on a personal level, and yet for the big picture to change, it has to kind of trickle up, right, to the policy level and governmental level ultimately. So do you have any insights into how that...
You are the expert, so I actually really want to ask you. I mean, I'll tell you, having only dabbled in the research on systems change, but just knowing that, you know, things don't change without pressure. Systems don't change without pressure. And so where does that pressure come from? I mean, sometimes it is just one powerful actor, but even then that powerful actor usually has the motivation of, you know, an army of shareholders or a group of citizens or, you know, a powerful group of environmentalists behind them telling them to do something. So I just don't think these two things exist in silos. And I mean, this is not my original thought. Like the literature, the scientific literature is coming to say as much. Obviously, you know, we know that for things to catalyze change, you need people to create that change. So lots of my drawings focus on that. And also just because I feel, and I'm sure you've read the research, not the research, but, you know, it's been revealed that a lot of this idea, like we're all in this together, individuals have to do everything, like this idea that comes actually from the system is a sort of way of putting it onto citizens who really don't necessarily have culpability. I mean, we just live in these systems that are impossible to navigate, as I kind of alluded to with this idea behind minimum viable planet. You know, you may just have to take a job that's very far away, so you have to drive. So people feel oppressed by these things, and they should, because they want to do more and they can't. And then at the same time, there's this other force telling them, oh, your individual actions don't matter and have no effect and are worthless. So it can't be both. There's a disconnect there, right? So, I mean, to me, I think, you know, oh, sorry, I'm gonna close the door because I hear kids scampering about. I think very clearly individual effects do have repercussions. You know, there's a cheeky graphic that people have recreated numerous times that said it's just one straw said 8 billion people. You know, how are we going to get people, how are we going to get the large manufacturers to say, the large beverages, it's late in the day. How are we going to get, you know, the chains to say we're going to have paper straws, we're only going to give straws on demand? Well, they're going to get that because a bunch of individuals pushed at that system and said, let's do this thing. So very simple, but obviously you need both things, and we need system change, but it comes from individuals coming together, and as Bill McKibben says, organize, come together as a force so you can push that system with greater strength.
Yes, I guess we have to understand the power we have as consumers, and to kind of step into that and have our voices heard and make demands on the people who want to make money from us ultimately, you know, because they depend on our what's the word, loyalty. you know, to function. So yeah, we need to use that power that we have to implement changes. Yeah, it's an interesting cycle, and I definitely hear this this idea, you know, that it's definitely a widely spread concept, you know, that if you take your canvas bags to the supermarket and, you know, turn your lights off and you know, turn the tap off when you're brushing your teeth, that's gonna, you know, prevent the climate crisis. But we know that it just, you know, there's a much bigger game at play, and we're just like, yeah, tiny pieces of that puzzle. But, you know, the increasing awareness around this issue is just causing massive waves now, isn't it? And yeah, I think what we're talking about is acknowledging that the current economic system is the main, you know, force behind ecosystem destruction and, you know, environmental crisis. That, you know, and I've said this in other interviews, so the danger of repeating myself, that, you know, we cannot function in this profit first system without destroying the planet at the same time, because yeah, it's just the resource use and the crazy inequality it's causing is just not sustainable in any way. Sure. So coming to your book that came out some years ago now, tell me a bit more about that. What inspired you to write it, and what did you discover in that process?
I think that was one of my first pieces that was like the shift from you know, just being a straightforward journalist to saying I have opinions. It was a visual essay that I'd done in short form for a now defunct, really great blog out of New York. And then someone just asked me to be my agent and make it into a book. So we did. And it was basically just, you know, I had done these, I think my way into caring about the climate was consumerism, realizing in my, you know, in the early aughts and in my 20s that like, oh, I finally had a job where I could buy things, and I realized I was buying frivolous things that I absolutely didn't need, and sort of suddenly becoming aware of the huge toll that fast fashion was taking and the implications on the planet. You know, sort of a new conversation. And I was by no means the first person to do it, but I think in 2006 I had done a year of no shopping. So I just didn't buy anything for a year, and instead I painted everything I wanted. Which I now, having become a student of behavioral science many years later, realize is like actually like a great behavioral tool for, you know, we have our system 1 and our system 2, and our system 1 is our rash, impulsive, must have this thing now, sort of must like emotional response to things, and our system 2 is more measured and rational. So by painting, I was actually just imposing a bit of time and space and, you know, a pause to like allow that emotional response of, oh, I love this, I must buy it, to go away and paint the thing. And I didn't know that at the time. It was just like, oh, I'll just paint things, and that'll be an artistic way of thinking about, you know, realizing that I can appreciate beautiful things without needing to own them. And it worked in that aspect as well. Just drawing and painting the things was like a really nice meditative way to be like, I have enough shoes, I don't need to buy these mint green saddle shoes. So yeah, the essay, it became a whole book, and I did some research on, you know, the nascent field of research into fast fashion at the time, and just, yeah, had a great time doing it. I'm still working on my second book. But basically it's just a way of thinking about what we actually need to buy and trying to buy less. And I, you know, it built a great habit, but I find I still slip back. So in 2012, I did it again. And this year I'm supposed to be doing it again, but I broke it once. So I've got like 6 more months to go, and I'm going to try to not break it again. But it's hard. But it's basically just, you know, and again, the same thing. I don't think my individual purchasing decisions are going to change the world completely, but we know we buy so many more clothes, especially, than we need. And the implications on the planet are disastrous. And I don't remember the exact stat now, but it's something shockingly high. Like I think fashion and textiles account for 10% of our emissions. don't I need to check that, because I just read the stat again, and it was like appallingly high. So I think people don't realize, they think, oh, it's just a few clothes or just this and that, but it's actually a huge percentage of our emissions. So yeah, that's kind of like, I've sort of left fast fashion as being the, you know, thrust of my work. It was just something I was really interested in at the time, but I mean, it's part of this same conversation. We just know that, you know, this individual behavior catalyzes greater change. More and more people are saying, you know, we want better clothes, we want more sustainable things, we want good product stewardship. I write a lot about just, you know, extended producer responsibility and lifetime guarantees, and the fact that like it's almost impossible to buy an appliance that will last the way the appliances we used to buy lasted. So I think these are really important conversations to have, you know, as well. Like, even though we think about, you know, again, it's part of the individual system dynamic. You know, if a bunch of people say these are shoddy stoves you're building, not talking about any stove in particular except for the one I own, you know, then eventually the manufacturer realizes that, you know, they have to do a better job and create more durable, long-lasting goods and have good product stewardship and offer warranties and repairs. And, you know, you see that happening. There's like right to repair bills all over the world. And I don't know, someone said it, I haven't done enough research to know whether it's got enough teeth, but someone said this new bill in France where all products will have to carry their sustainability rating. I mean, it's a step forward, because I believe in disclosure. Like, disclosure is not a means unto itself. You know, you need to have good regulation and all this sort of stuff, but just people being able to see whether the product they're buying is sustainable or not is really important. And they'll be ranked, you know, by category. So we're seeing interesting things happening. That was a long-winded answer to your question, but that's what my book is about in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, there's lots of things I could pick up on there. Yeah, in fact, I came across your work in Yes magazine. It was a comic strip about people buying, you know, or having to repair or not be able to repair, you know, products that were breaking down so quickly. And it made me think of this new wave of repair cafes that are opening up in different communities and transition towns and stuff. And yeah, you know, on one level we can say, well, that's just, you know, that's a small detail, but it's what I feel about, say, the repair cafes or just say the transition town movement in itself is that it's a way of people preparing at a local level for a change that's going to come, you know, ultimately a less consumerist society, which we need to work towards. And it's almost like you had to deprogram your journalism training. It's like we have to deprogram our consumerist lifestyle. You know, it's like it's become so ingrained in the richer parts of the world anyway, that and in the poorer parts of the world, you know, it's kind of looked up to often or idolized. So yeah, I like to really turn that on its head and just say, actually, this isn't what brings meaning to our lives, you know. Craftsmanship and, you know, good quality, lives being filled by good quality things that don't just break, because, and I hate to say it, I feel like they're designed to break because it means buying new ones, right? It's just like
the planned obsolescence of
exactly.
It's overwhelming.
And what well, also I was curious to know so with your no buying, what are the parameters of that? I mean, presumably you buy food.
I'm very, I mean, for people who don't buy anything, there was a woman who wrote about, gosh, this must be like, goes back a decade, where she didn't buy anything. She bartered for food, like everything. I just talk about not buying clothes for myself because I think, and stuff for myself because I think that's my weakness. I mean, I do not deprive my kids. I actually had a pile of socks and I was like, I'm not going to buy them new socks. I'm going to darn all these. And like, I got through 2 socks and then I just ordered them some more socks. So I try to be like reasonable about it, but for me, it's just not buying any new stuff. But yeah, it's tough. Even that. Other people do much more. And I posted on my Instagram and just said anyone who wants to join me, and got like hundreds of takers. And, you know, people did much, much more impressive commitments. Like, you know, whatever your lifestyle can accommodate, whatever you feel you can reasonably do. Because I think it should be something that's hard, but not, you know, we have enough to deal with right now in the world. So, you know, for some people it was just, I'm going to try to, you know, buy a little bit less, and for other people it was like, I'm going to live in a yurt and make all my own butter. But like, just do what works for you is my general take.
Yeah. And what impact or what feedback have you received from others since then, since you wrote the book? And
it's funny, it's so old now, and people still just always want to talk about it, or always want to do it, or always want tips, because it's something that I think, you know, people really wrestle with. Because I mean, in the book I talk a lot about how there's so much guilt, and there's this guilt foisted upon, I think, in women in particular, that we consume too much. Meanwhile, you know, we're often, well, the stat in Canada is that we're responsible for 80% of household budgets. So, you know, we're the people who are out buying things for the house. So the fact that we buy a bit more is just, it's like a hazard of the job. Never mind the fact there's also billions and billions of dollars spent on marketing directly to women, growing increasingly sophisticated with every passing day. So I think people feel this like huge guilt around everything they purchase, whether it's a useful purchase or a frivolous purchase. And so they always just want to talk about it to sort of think about what they can do, or to alleviate that guilt, or, you know, just to unlock some ideas. So yeah, it's neat to see, because I think also people do really feel good when they do it. It's like I said, with all individual actions, it's just, you know, these little things you do may not be so huge by themselves, but they reinforce different, they you know, it's Robert Cialdini, like just foot in the door, you know, they create this sense of identity. And once you're like, oh, I'm a person who can not shop for a year, then you're like, oh, I'm a person who can advocate for much greater change in the world, like, you know, stopping fast fashion at the source. So, you know, it's just, yeah, I have really good conversations with people about it. And that's why, even though I'm just kind of not past that, but like, I just mention it every once in a while on Instagram to get people to do a challenge or whatever with me, because it's fun also to do it together and hold each other accountable. And I think I'm overdue actually for like a mid-year, how's everybody doing? And what do you need? What do you need a boost on? And how are you managing?
yeah, it's great to be supporting people with those kind of micro changes in their lives, because I think, I mean, I know, having taken on some changes in myself this last year or so, it's also about kind of living with integrity, you know, and if we're doing that in these kind of small ways, you know, the impact then that then has on the communities, and it does spread, you know, like yeah. I told my friend that I'd stopped shopping in supermarkets, and she was inspired. She was like, I never used to shop in supermarkets. I'm not going to shop in supermarkets anymore. You know, I'm just going to go back to how I was doing it before. So yeah, it makes a difference, you know, on a small level. But then I think, yes, like you say, people then feel inspired to do something bigger than that.
Yeah, but no, you're totally right. That's such a good example. It's not just the internal desire to do more, it's the social normification of doing something different. So your friend sees you, and then her friend sees her, and then his friend sees her. And before you know it, you know, like something that once seemed just not top of mind is being done by everybody in your sphere of influence. So that's also really important.
Yeah, and tell me about your work with Clean Prosperity.
Sure, yeah, I've been working there for about a year. We're a small nonprofit climate or policy organization here in Canada, and I know you're all over the world, so viewers might not know. So Canada just actually improved some pretty substantial carbon tax policy, I guess maybe 6 weeks ago. So we work largely on encouraging all parties to have better climate policy, but in particular, we've been working really hard to get them to implement strong carbon pricing, because to our mind, it's just impossible for us to make the changes we need in the Canadian economy when carbon is not actually being taxed at, I won't get into the weeds, but the social cost of carbon, the idea that, you know, we're not paying the full price for all the goods in society. So I work on that by day, but less so on the policy side. I run a website and part of the organization that speaks to the public. So it's a lot of the work, similar ideas to what we've been speaking about, just trying to get the Canadian public aware of climate and to eventually talk about climate policy and carbon pricing, but just to first, you know, air basic ideas about climate and get people involved and reading our newsletter to hear about what's going on in Canada when it comes to climate. So what else can I tell you? Yeah, that's the gist of it.
And so based on all the learning and experience you've got in this field, what would you say are the systemic changes that the world needs most right now?
Yeah, well, from a systems level, I mean, I think putting a price on carbon, like when you suddenly wrap your head around the fact that that people are allowed, people in companies, corporations, what have you, dump pollution in the air for free. I think like once that idea confronts you, like I was late to just really thinking about the policy changes, interventions that could happen. And it was only about 4 or 5 years ago that I started thinking like, what at scale needs to happen, because we have so little time. And it's like, well, there are lots of things. I mean, Project Drawdown has, hundreds of solutions, but when you think about the fact that like we don't pay for the pollution that is dumped into the world, and this idea of the social cost of carbon, like the fact that we don't accurately measure how bad that is just, to my mind, kind of shocking. So that's why I wanted to work on carbon pricing. And I think at a systems level, what needs to happen is we need carbon pricing from 2 or 3 of the biggest countries, and then very quickly you see the rest of the world follow suit. So I won't get into the weeds with it because I could go on forever, but like a border carbon adjustment, or we see the EU adopting some form of carbon pricing. We just we need, who knows what's going to happen with Biden, but I think people see the scale of change needed and get really fearful and think it's impossible. And we are no doubt in this precarious moment where the amount of things that need to change in a very short amount of time to stave off the climate crisis is huge. But at the same time, some things can happen really quickly with these upstream top level policy interventions. And so the fact, for example, that we now have carbon pricing in Canada, I mean, to the extent that it's going to be raised by $15 every year, is like, that should very quickly signal to large producers that they need to make huge changes in the way they produce their goods, and tells consumers that they'll be incentivized to consume less and to make switches to environmentally sound technologies. So I think it actually just gives me hope that like those top level policy changes can have huge effect. Did I answer your question? I forgot what the initial question was.
Yeah, no, I was asking, what changes do you feel are most pressing? And could you just for the novices amongst us, could you explain, give an example of how carbon pricing works just on a day-to-day level?
Yeah, people get confounded by it, but basically, I mean, you want people to do less of something or use less of something, you make it cost more. So the cost of the unsustainable, highly carbon intensive good rises, while the cost of the less carbon intensive good decreases, and eventually people choose accordingly. Lots of simple metaphors. You go to the grocery store and the coffee from I don't know where costs $15 a pound, and the other coffee costs $13 a pound, and then a carbon tax or some sort of carbon pricing is created, and suddenly you see that one coffee is $18 a pound and the other coffee is $10 a pound, because that company was able to start sourcing their beans in a much more sustainable way and transporting it in a more sustainable way, and making all these inroads into how to do things better. And as a result, the consumer is given a new choice and hopefully chooses the more sustainable product. Does that clarify?
Yeah, that really helps. So would it
large organizations have a little bit of a certain market certainty and say, oh, this is a price that's going to rise every year, so here are the changes I need to make in my factory or what have you, so that I can be competitive and produce my goods and not produce so many emissions.
So it's partly about how goods are produced, but presumably also how local the produce is, like how far it travels to get to the shelter.
It's highly contingent upon, and that's why another thing that I'm really interested in is carbon labeling. And people assume that the local good is better, but that's not necessarily the case. In Canada, there's all sorts of data. I think local has other benefits. So I like to buy local because I like to support local farmers because they live in my community. But sometimes the, you know, carbon intensivity of a hothouse produced tomato that was grown in Canada in February is worse than, you know, something being shipped in. I think the biggest thing is air freight versus any other kind of, like, once something is coming by air, then there's no way it can be nearly as sustainable as anything else. But again, there needs to be a simple heuristic that helps people. But to my mind, that would be labels that tell you exactly. So you get a sense, like, how can you know when you go to choose between, you know, the tofu sandwich or the egg salad sandwich or the chicken sandwich, if you're just kind of guessing in a vacuum. But yeah, but I didn't mean to go too far down the carbon pricing thing. I think there's lots of other systems, like we need climate accountability, and we just passed our first climate accountability legislation here in Canada, or proposed it. And I think once other countries bring in higher levels of climate accountability, that will help too, because, you know, what good are all these targets if we're not actually, like, you know, punished in any way if we don't meet them. So I think we need to see climate accountability. We need stronger COP26 commitments, and I think and hope we might see them, just based on where things seem to be going. So I think we've got, like, so many high level things that could happen that we can be advocating for, that there's, you know, despite the horrors of the world, some room for optimism.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks for sharing all about your work, and yeah, and just sharing your passion for this topic. It's really,
thank you for having
me. It's really great to, great to hear about everything you've been doing, and any hints at what your next book might be about? You mentioned you might be working on one.
I just can't be bothered to print a book on paper. I know that is, like, such a wild idea, but that's why I do my newsletter, and I can offset my newsletter, so it's basically a thing that can exist with, and that was the goal of my newsletter. Like, initially it was going to be ideas for a book, but I've sort of just lost my desire to actually condense it in a book when I can just put it out there on the internet and people can read it for free. So maybe at some point. But the one person I'm really interested in that I always recommend people check out, because I'm a Florida native and I contemplated writing a book on her, but instead I just did an essay for Yes, is Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, who is this amazing environmentalist who saved the Everglades in Florida. And there hasn't been enough written about her, and there's not enough about her. So if I ever find time, that's like the half-baked proposal for my next book. But you don't need to read my book. You can just read the many great things written about her already and get inspired, because she's amazing.
And how would people find your work, Sarah? What's the easiest way to tune in?
mvp.ist, which is where my newsletter is, and links to all my work, or my website is sarahL.com, Sarah with an H, L.com. And yeah.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining me today, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your day, and continue doing your great work. Thanks.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.